The Korean War gets a lot less attention than the wars that America participated in immediately before and after it, World War II and the Vietnam War. But anyone who is interested in history and why the world is the way it is today should know about the Korean War. Understanding the Korean War shows how the American Armed Services went from being a force that could destroy Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan to a military that failed to stop the communist takeover in Vietnam. In some ways, the Korean War was almost much more disastrous for the Americans than Vietnam. In fact, at one point, the North Koreans almost pushed the American army out of the country for good, and the South Koreans, whom the Americans were allied with, did some terrible things that will make you wonder why the U.S. even wanted to fight for them in the first place. At least 2 million civilians died, although that number might be much closer to 3 million. Similarly, the combined military deaths were at least 500,000 and might be well over 1 million. But it was also a weird war where both sides made some strange decisions. Today, let's go back in time to reveal weird and sad things about the Korean War that you didn't know. Viewer discretion is advised for this video, as some of this video may be offensive or disturbing. We, the makers of this video, in no way support or condone the atrocities that were committed during the Korean War. In the lead-up to the war, the South Korean President Syngman Rhee forced anyone he suspected of being a communist sympathizer to enroll in a re-education program that was supposed to set them on the correct way of thinking. And when they couldn't find enough communist sympathizers, they just started forcibly enrolling random people into this education program. Then, when war officially broke out, these people were imprisoned. 2 days after the North Korean army invaded South Korea in 1950, the South Korean president ordered the execution of the people in this re-education program, and also people who were part of the South Korean Workers' Party. From that day onward, huge swaths of people were massacred by the South Korean government. When the U.S. entered the war, little happened to stop the heartless acts. Instead, some commanders even approved of the executions. Others, such as General Douglas MacArthur, turned a blind eye to the atrocities. The youngest known victim of these massacres was a young girl in her teens. The most common method of execution was by firearm, but the South Koreans also used crueler methods. For instance, suspected communist sympathizers who lived on the coast were often tied together and thrown into the sea, ensuring that they would drown. The saddening ordeal was then suppressed until the 1990s and 2000s, when South Korea's government ended its authoritarian regime and became much more democratic. The government has since uncovered thousands of human remains. The true extent of the massacres may never be known. After the North Koreans invaded South Korea, you'd be right in thinking that the Americans acted quickly to defend the South. But you'd be wrong in thinking that this went smoothly, as the first U.S. battle highlights. Less than 2 weeks after the outbreak of the war, American soldiers arrived on the Korean Peninsula with the goal of forcing the communists back. The first American engagement was the Battle of Osan, which occurred on the 5th of July, 1950. The day before, the U.S. soldiers, who were made up of a group of 540 GIs from a few different battalions that had been hastily grouped together, nicknamed Task Force Smith, set up defensive stations on 2 hills on both sides of the road just outside the village of Osan. Task Force Smith's soldiers were almost all teenage boys. Only 1/6 of the men had combat experience. Most had only been trained for a total of 8 weeks before being deployed into the theater of war. And to defend themselves, they had equipment that dated to the early days of World War II. Few of these weapons were strong enough to pierce North Korean tank armor, and what made matters worse was that the group only had a total of 6 anti-tank rounds. On the morning of July 5th, the soldiers saw 8 North Korean tanks approaching. The timing was terrible, as they approached during a heavy rainstorm, meaning that air support could not aid the men. At 8:16 a.m., the Americans fired on the tanks with artillery fire. Then they watched in horror as the tanks continued to creep forward, barely scratched. The tanks reached a roadblock that the Americans had set up. The Americans fired their 6 anti-tank rounds. 2 of the tanks were damaged, a third one caught on fire. A North Korean then exited this flaming tank and fired on the Americans, killing one GI before being killed himself. The Americans were then able to disable another tank by hitting its tracks, but the North Koreans then destroyed the American communication lines, making logistical coordination impossible. When things seemed hopeful, another 25 North Korean tanks rode up to the Americans. Soon, most of the North Korean tanks had ridden past the Americans without being damaged, with the tanks firing upon the U.S. posts. The surviving Americans tried their best to fortify what was left of their defenses when 3 more tanks and a column of trucks that stretched as far as they could see arrived. The Americans shot at these tanks and trucks. Some trucks were destroyed, but by 2:30 p.m., the Americans had used up all of their ammo and suffered heavy losses. The survivors retreated. Wounded Americans stayed behind, hoping that the North Koreans would imprison them. Instead, the Americans were all rounded up. Those that still had 2 arms were bound with the communication line wires that the tanks had disabled, and they were terminated. Task Force Smith lost almost half of its soldiers in that battle. The North Korean invasion force had been delayed by a grand total of 7 hours. Sadly, the Americans took a long time to learn from their mistakes in this battle. Over the month of July, similar battles played out across the Korean Peninsula, with inexperienced American soldiers using ineffective weapons and inevitably being overwhelmed. Because the U.S. Army was so badly equipped and trained, the North Koreans were on the verge of winning the war within 2 months of first invading South Korea. Throughout July, the American and South Korean armies just kept on getting pushed further and further south. By early August, the North Koreans had taken over 90% of the peninsula. Kim Il-sung, the North Korean leader, thought that victory was imminent. Instead, the Americans and the South Koreans were able to fortify the 10% of the land that they had been pushed back to on the southeastern tip of the peninsula. On August 2, 1950, the U.S. and South Korean armies finally succeeded in halting the North Korean advance. Soon, the Americans had planned a counteroffensive to take back the land they had lost. Another division, nicknamed Task Force Keene, which was composed of 20,000 men, headed west to take the Cheonju Pass, which would allow the Americans and South Koreans to rapidly move further inland. Task Force Keene headed toward the Cheonju Pass on August 7th, but as they left their base, they encountered thousands of North Korean troops who had been attempting to reach Task Force Keene's base. The 2 armies fought bitterly out in the open until both sides set up temporary bases. For the next 3 days, the Americans and North Koreans fought incredibly bloody battles. Eventually, the Task Force Keene was beaten back to their original base, failing to take any land. Once more, the Americans had been defeated. Instead, the South Koreans and Americans had to remain in their tiny block of land, bitterly defending it throughout August and the first half of September 1950. The never-give-up mentality of the U.S. and South Korean soldiers proved to be victorious. At 6:30 a.m. on September 15, 1950, hundreds of ships approached the coastal city of Incheon, which was based hundreds of miles north of the land that the U.S. ground forces were defending. Much like D-Day in World War II, thousands of American soldiers stormed the beaches, destroying North Korean defensive positions. The North Koreans were taken completely by surprise, and the poorly maintained defensive positions were soon abandoned. Within 2 weeks of this surprise amphibious assault, the Korean capital of Seoul was back in American and South Korean hands. The North Koreans also suffered heavy losses. In fact, by mid-October, America had taken in over 135,000 North Korean prisoners of war. From that point onward, America and South Korea had the upper hand in the war. You may think that this account is an exaggeration of just how close the North Koreans came to taking over the entire Korean peninsula. Well, it isn't. Even the American commanders at the time realized that they were on the brink of defeat. For instance, General Matthew Ridgway said that, quote, "The war would have been over in 60 days with all Korea in communist hands if it hadn't been for the U.S.'s Air Force." Most people know that North Korea is one of the strangest and most secretive nations on Earth. While every country has embraced internationalism to a certain degree, the North Korea of the present day is known as the Hermit Kingdom, which refuses to integrate with other countries. It reveals very little about what happens within its borders, and even then, much of what it says is blatant propaganda. Why is this? It all lies in the fact that North Korea and South Korea are technically still at war. Of course, nowadays, battles are not being fought between North Korean and South Korean soldiers. So in that sense, it isn't a physical war, but it is still happening because no side has ever formally ended the war. Instead, this is how the conflict ended. In June 1953, the Communist forces and the combined U.S., South Korean, and UN forces had been locked in a stalemate for years. In that month, they fired millions of shells at one another. This led to a major escalation in hostilities. To soldiers on the ground, it must have seemed like the fighting would only get worse. But the communist governments were actually in the process of ending the war at this point. Joseph Stalin, the ruler of the Soviet Union for decades, had died in early 1953. The remaining Soviet leaders, who were in an internal power struggle to become the new ruler, lost interest in supporting the North Korean war. Suddenly, the North Koreans and the Chinese lost all their resources. Soon, the North Koreans accepted peace talks with the United Nations. By the end of July, most of the heads of the nations at war had signed the Korean Armistice Agreement, ending immediate hostilities. But this agreement makes it clear that the war is not over. Instead, it says that all fighting shall stop, quote, until a final peace settlement is achieved. So basically, this agreement is a stopgap measure to prevent lives from being lost until final peace accords can be drafted. But no final peace agreement has ever been signed. In fact, South Korea hasn't even accepted the terms of the Korean Armistice Agreement, and no representative from South Korea has ever signed it. This was because the then South Korean president, Syngman Rhee, still wanted to take the entire Korean peninsula. Of course, without support from America, he did not have the strength to do this, so the fighting stopped. Because of this, the Korean War is still officially ongoing. When the fighting officially ended, all of the soldiers who had been captured by either side were freed and allowed to return home. Not all of them did. As can be expected, tens of thousands of North Korean and Chinese soldiers refused to return to their communist dictatorships and remained in the West. A small number of South Korean soldiers, 327 to be precise, remained in North Korea. Many of these people probably had family in the North and they wanted to stay with them. But most weirdly of all, 21 Americans and one Scottish soldier who had been captured refused to return home. Instead, they chose to remain under communist influence. These men all had different reasons. Some were genuinely impressed with the communist way of life. Others were disgusted by the injustices of their home country. One such individual was Clarence Adams. Adams was a corporal who originally came from Memphis, Tennessee. He was African American, so he had seen more than his fair share of suffering in the pre-civil rights USA. In communist prison, for the first time ever, he had access to a high standard of education. He studied communist political theory. Once he had become an expert on the subject, he started lecturing other American prisoners on what he considered to be the virtues of communism. When the war ended, Adams knew that the other American soldiers would say that he had spent his entire incarceration learning about and preaching about communism, meaning that he would probably face even more prison time and be given a dishonorable discharge. So Adams moved to China and married a Chinese woman. He remained sympathetic to the communist way of life. In fact, during the Vietnam War, Adams would often appear on communist radio shows, during which he would plead for the American soldiers in Vietnam to return to the U.S. and fight for civil equality. But in 1966, Adams decided to return to America because communism could not provide him with the thing he wanted most in this world, his mother. The U.S. government did subpoena him shortly after his return, but he avoided prison time. Instead, he opened a Chinese restaurant in Memphis. Most of the imprisoned soldiers who sided with communism eventually returned home. Perhaps the soldier who was most successful was Corporal Morris Wills, who returned to America in 1965 and ended up at Harvard University. Well, that's all we have for you. Thank you for watching Nutty History. Please hit that like button and subscribe for more Nutty History.